This is the fifth week of sort of a thematic overview of the book of Revelation. And as I said kind of during our announcements, part of my goal has been to help make accessible these major themes so that we can begin to hear in this book some major ideas, especially so that next week some things begin to stand out to us. And this will be our fifth week of this thematic approach. And then next week we'll do our read through together, hearing Revelation, and then we'll spend 7 weeks working through chapters 2 and 3, the 7 messages to the 7 churches of Revelation. So that gives you an idea as if you're looking for places to read. Also in our weekly newsletter, I often will send ideas or suggestions on places you might read, some of the Old Testament contexts that we might address on Sunday morning to give you a little jump into what we're doing on Sunday mornings. If you'll open your Bible to Revelation chapter 19. And I want to read for us this morning one of the more familiar passages, visions. This vision anticipates the arrival of the new heavens and the new earth, and it's the coming of Christ. Beginning in verse 11. Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many crowns, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword, with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh, he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Amen. I hope you recognized some of the imagery from there. Much of it has been incorporated into some of our music and other sort of modes that I hope you recognize some of it. You can't depend on your eyes when your imagination is out of focus. This is a quote by Mark Twain. And it seemed to me to fit quite nicely with the belief and what appears to be the intention of John, the author of Revelation. Hear it again. You can't depend on your eyes when your imagination is out of focus. In other words, don't believe what you see or what you hear if the way that you imagine God, the way that you imagine the world, or the way that you imagine even God working in the world, if there's a chance that your imagination with regard to those 3 things are somehow out of whack, be careful of what you think you see, of what you think you hear. Because until our imagination is in focus, we will interpret the world around us in bizarre ways. This, to me, is what it seems that Mark Twain is saying, although likely not coming from a Christian context. But I think this is certainly what the author of Revelation is saying to us. And I want to offer an example before we kind of get into some of the text this morning. And I won't force you to reveal what is within your imaginations. But our imaginations have the ability hearing just a single word, to bring images to our minds, to bring phrases to our minds, to bring ideas to the forefront. Our minds, our imaginations can do this instantly when we hear words. And I want to offer you a word, and I want for you to would you just close your eyes for a second, and as you hear the word, just allow those images, phrases, whatever they are, to just kind of come in front of you and just sort of fill your thoughts. Beauty. Beauty. Take note of those first things to sort of arise. Those images, those phrases, those ideas about beauty that instantly begin to surface. That's what our imaginations are made of. And our ability to imagine beauty has been shaped in us over our lifetimes. Our ability, our imagination with regards to beauty has been given to us through years and years of television watching, of walking through the grocery store and of seeing the magazines that are there that sort of declare what beauty should be or might be, sort of offering a standard by which we might measure our standard of beauty. Our imagination with regards to beauty has been given to us as we've been evaluated over the years, sometimes affirmed and sometimes rejected because of our appearance. Our imaginations have been culturally formed. They've been formed through our lives, and they're deeply rooted in us. And knowing even myself, I think many of us might for a moment feel shame if someone could get a glimpse of our mental evaluations of others. And we say that we want more to beauty. We want to understand beauty in different ways, and yet we still default to these sort of cultural modes. How much effort do we really want to put in? Do we really want to exert to acquire a new imagination with regards to beauty? Harvard has done a study and a series of studies and is continuing to do them on bias and prejudice. And it's based on surveys that you can go online and anybody can take, and it all kind of works together and is accumulated into sort of their ongoing data. And what's interesting about what they're finding is that consistently, all of us, even those of us who would adamantly say, I am not biased, I have no prejudice against anyone for any differences, we all carry them. And they all show up in these surveys. And what's important about this for us to recognize is that as much as we want to deny that these things exist in us, I think it's true that our imaginations begin to bleed into the way that we live and our interactions with other people. That our actions continue to be influenced by our imaginations, whether we admit it or not. And this struck me this week as I was thinking about, I can't remember how I came across this video, but some of you will recognize the name Susan Boyle. Some of you will recognize the names Jonathan and Charlotte. Both of these, Susan and Jonathan and Charlotte, were contestants on Britain's Got Talent. And then Andrew De Leon was a contestant on America's Got Talent. And each of these performers show up on this show, and they bring an entire audience, not only to tears, but to their feet in just emotional applause because of their performances. And I don't think it is entirely because of how well they sing. And I think we want to sort of believe sometimes that this response is based on their performance. They're gifted. There's no doubt about it. But But our world has lots of gifted performers, and we've heard some incredible performances, and these were good performances, but something else is at work. Could it be that the audience's inability, sitting there in the crowd, to imagine these performers walking on stage, and if you're familiar with them, generally they have been affirmed to be beneath our sort of cultural or average standards of attractiveness or acceptability. And so these audiences are sitting back, and they somehow have the inability to imagine beyond their deeply rooted standards of what beauty might be, that this person, this human being, might be able to offer something of value. If you watch these videos, it's wild because the moment they step on the stage, the audience begins to snicker. Some of them lean back like this. You can see there's an immediate disconnect based solely on their appearance. Their expectation being what it was based on their appearance. They were shocked. They were struck by the disconnect, the tension between their inability to believe that this person could offer anything of beauty, and suddenly there is this beauty that is exiting from their mouths as they sing. And they're moved to tears by how sharp this contrast is between their expectations and what really was. These moments happen in our lives where we're struck by the fact that our expectations are not reality and that there is something else at work. But these moments where our imaginations prove to be inadequate, where they prove to be too small, they're tiny, or they're out of focus, these moments, I think, are rare for us. Maybe they're a bit more common now that we have YouTube and we can just watch these videos right in a row. But I think there's a couple reasons these things are rare. One of them is because it's hard to let people have the chance to prove to us that our perception is wrong. It's hard. We make initial judgments and then we interact accordingly. And so to let somebody in, to have enough access to us that they could actually prove us wrong, that there could be something of substance there, is just a hard move for us. And then on the other hand, it is really hard if you have ever found yourself attempting to go against a cultural norm, to redefine beauty. There are those who will oppose you. And so sometimes it's just easier to let things be as they are, to just accept your imagination as it is. The book of Revelation is about setting our imaginations free. To imagine the power and the love of God at work in your life and in this world in ways that far exceed what you ever on your own could imagine God might be able to do. This book, it sets to take our tiny expectations based on our own experiences and to blow them up into cosmic, cross-shaped imaginations. Remember last week, we talked about the ways that Revelation does this consistently. It takes our expectations as the hearer and it sort of sets them out for us, leading us towards them. And then it twists the story on us. It pulls the sheet off and it reveals things as they really are. Revelation intends to reveal, right? I mean, it seems sometimes, though, I think we have this impression that Revelation is trying to like hide things and make things mysterious and hard, but I think it's just the opposite. It's supposed to be understood, but sometimes because the book uses subversive methods, it kind of sneaks around the back door. You actually have to have ears to hear. You have to be attentive and listening to the ways that the author is sort of dangling your expectations out in front of you, and you say, oh yeah, that sounds right, and then pulling them away at the last second and saying, oh wait, it's actually another way. That's what's happening to us. And it's just like a man or a woman who steps onto a stage and whose questionable appearance or attractiveness sort of drops your guard so low that they just shock you at their ability to create beautiful music. And it just evokes this emotional response because you're just not ready for it. Revelation intends to take us off guard so as to engage our emotions, to shock us out of our expectations. And it does it by taking familiar language and like I said, sort of appearing to give us, the hearer, exactly what we want or what we expect. We haven't done much yet with Revelation with regards to the context that it was written in. What were these people like? What was their world like? What was going on in the first century? What kinds of things prompted John to write this crazy letter? Because that's the form that Revelation is in. It's a letter. The whole thing is a letter to these 7 churches. So why? What is it all about? And we're going to explore that more, especially as we get into each of the 7 churches, because the purpose of its being written is really critical there. But this morning I want to say one thing about the context of this letter, sort of the circumstances around the churches and their lives. These were a people, the recipients of this letter were a people who had been conquered. They had been conquered by the Roman Empire. These are people who had experienced the conquest of the greatest military to exist up to that day, the greatest military power and threat they had endured. It's conquering. And in fact, they continued to live each day in fear, essentially, of the conquering abilities of their Roman overlords. And early in Revelation, in chapter 2, there's a message to a church in Ephesus. And this is where it gets started. Jesus speaking words through John. Actually, it's through an angel, through John, and through another angel. It's kind of crazy, but that's kind of what's happening. But the message comes to the Ephesian Christians there. And here is what it says. Conquer. Conquer. You are to conquer. This is your work. And the Ephesian Christians, they knew about conquering as those who had been conquered. And depending on your translation, yours might say overcome. It might say emerges victoriously. Those are kind of the 3 ways that it's sort of translated. But much like the images, the phrases, the ideas that come to your mind when I say the word beauty, the word conquer would have carried significant and emotional meaning for these people. They were a conquered people. This isn't just a passive word. This is a word that they know intimately. In fact, these churches are made up of Jews. There are Jewish members within these congregations. We can be pretty convinced that John himself was Jewish. Just the emphasis on the Old Testament sort of gives us some indications there. But these Jewish members of the congregation would have had a living memory of, meaning this would have happened in their lifetimes, a living memory of the Roman armies march into Jerusalem and destruction of their holy city. The Roman Empire's entrance into Jerusalem to destroy their beloved temple. Even the early Jewish Christians continued to travel to Jerusalem and to the temple. This continued to be an important place for them. And these Jewish Christians, they would have experienced another exile at the hands of a conquering empire. They knew what it meant to be conquered. But then there's also Gentiles in this community, Jews and Gentiles together. And these communities are a bit closer to Rome. And Rome, there were Christian communities that had been in Rome, and these Christians, Jews, and Gentiles also were still within living memory of an emperor named Nero. An Emperor Nero, he had this, he was having troubles in his empire. And Christians became a convenient scapegoat. It's those Christian congregations here in Rome. It's their fault. And it worked out conveniently for him. But consider for a second what, for us, the phrase 9/11 does for you. Consider what it brings to your imagination, what memories it brings up, the emotions it brings up, even phrases associated with it, war on terror, whatever it is that sort of engages you with that event in our living memory. Well, the name Nero and even Rome had a powerful emotional tug on these people. See, because Nero was known for throwing garden parties. And these Christians who were convenient scapegoats for the troubles of the area also became convenient torches for these garden parties. Human torches lit on fire. There are also records of Christians being wrapped in animal skins and being hung over a spit, essentially. These are the kinds of things that conquerors do. People who need to maintain their power and their grip on a culture. You need to instill fear. These are what conquerors do. Conquerors flex their muscles. They hold up their weapon and they show you that theirs is bigger than yours, and then they wave it in the air to remind you who conquered who. This is what conquerors do. And if you're Rome, you even have an added benefit. You don't just have a military, but you sort of have a whole way of life that you just drop on people. So you show up to the outer ends of your empire, and you show up to a town and you say, "We have a gift for you. It's called Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Will you accept it?" And if you say no, you get destroyed, and you then exist as an example to others. What kind of peace is that? But if you were spared, if you received the peace and protection of the empire, well, you would be the recipient of the empire's generosity. Roman paraphernalia would fill your lives and would fill your imaginations as Romans would come into your town, and they would lay a road right through the center just to remind you you're Roman. And then they would build towers in your town that would tower over you and remind you that Rome is watching. And then they would build for you gymnasiums and temples and theaters, all kinds of ways to entertain you, to keep you distracted and indebted to this great peace bringer. And on top of that, Rome had their soldiers and they had their tax collectors who were just a constant presence and reminder that you are not a free people. And that peace requires constant military vigilance. Can you imagine that being your understanding of conquer and what it means to conquer? This was a world so shaped by the sword and by oppressive power that the imagination of these oppressed people could hardly help but hope for these conquerors to get what was coming to them. And to hear an invitation to be part of conquering. This is the message that comes from John. The call to the church in Ephesus, to the church in Smyrna, to the church in Pergamum, and you get the idea all the way through. Conquer. Conquer. That's the call. So what does it mean? Many have failed to read or to hear revelation as it was intended to be heard. Because rather than hearing it as an intentionally crafted literary work designed like our movies and our books that we enjoy and that we pick up and we read through from beginning to end, except for my wife, who likes to jump to the end and then jump back into the beginning. But she still reads straight through after she's jumped ahead. But just like that, Revelation is no different. But what we tend to do is we tend to grab snippets of it. We grab this part and we grab this part and we kind of draw them together and we try to make sense of them. But we tend to be drawn to those snippets that help keep our imaginations intact and small. But this isn't unique to Revelation. We do this with much of the Bible. We tend to do this with a lot of our beliefs. So this is sort of commonly accepted that we naturally gravitate towards reading things that affirm our imaginations. It's hard to read something that penetrates into the way we imagine things to be and to hear them say, nope, it's not, and what do you do with that? And so rather than allow that kind of tension or ambiguity, I'm going to read things that help me solidify my imagination. And so our imaginations continue to stay unaffected and small. In many ways, our imaginations are not that different from the ancient world that received the book of Revelation. At least not when it comes to conquering and power. As Americans, and we've just celebrated our primary national holiday. And if we consider it for a moment, it's a holiday that essentially affirms the same basic claim that these ancient churches operated under. That conquering by the sword is necessary and in fact can be good. He who holds the sword calls the shots. Freedom is acquired by the one who can maintain it through military might. This is our imagination when it comes to war and conquering and power. But Revelation wants to expand our imagination. And it does so in a way slightly different than some of the other books in the New Testament, but it echoes the same sorts of things. You might recognize this from Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world. In other words, act differently, live differently than those around you. The patterns of this world are ordered and orchestrated in such ways that are in direct opposition to the way of Christ. So act differently. Act according to the way of Jesus. Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world. And Paul continues, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Allow your entire way of life to be changed by gaining a better, more focused, expanded imagination for how the world really works. The call to conquer, it extends to the 7 churches. But the call to conquer extends even to us today. And so are our conquering imaginations in focus? Can our eyes be trusted? I want to consider how Revelation helps us to creatively reimagine the world. And we start very much like we did the very first week. We start kind of in the beginning and we start moving our way from church to church. And to each church, there is a call. There's a call to conquer. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, each one to the one who conquers. But each call then is connected. It's partnered with a promise. Week 2, we explored and we began to imagine what God might be finally doing, the work of new creation, a new heavens and a new earth. Well, each of these calls to conquer, if you look at them in chapters 2 and 3, to the one who conquers, there's a promise, and that promise is directly linked to the promise of new creation in Revelation 21 and 25. So, to conquer, in essence, is a call to pursue and to receive all of God and all of God's blessings, all of his promised blessings. And so church to church, this message unfolds. Conquer. God says, and I will give you all of myself. Because, that's the heart of what the new creation vision even is. It is a promise that God would dwell with us more fully than we even know right now. To receive all of God in our midst for the rest of eternity. And so we move from church to church, but then at the end of chapter 3, verse 21, there's an interesting change to the phrase. The phrase has been consistent: to the one who conquers, and a promise. To the one who conquers, a promise. But here it changes, it shifts to the one who conquered, as I conquered. There's a qualification. It's changed here. And what we discover here is that we can't just conquer anyway, and any way is not going to do, but it has to be as I conquered. That's the way that we are to conquer, as Jesus has conquered. And then from chapter 3, we move into chapters 4 and chapters 5, and we've explored those together. These are the scenes of the heavenly throne room. Chapter 4 is the one where we find the one sitting on the throne being worshiped. And then we move into chapter 5, and this is where we get more shape to as I conquered. Because in chapter 5, we discover it's the conqueror. It's the one who has conquered, who is declared worthy to open the scroll of judgment upon the earth. It's this one who's the conqueror. And so John, he turns. Remember, we looked at this last week. He turns to see what he expects to be this mighty warrior king. And he looks, and it's a lamb who has been slaughtered. As I conquered. We fleshed that out. As I conquered, as I offered my life for my enemies. It's sort of a very unconqueror-like mode of living and of conquering, right? But this is where Revelation gets fun as we're reading and we're kind of paying attention to what's happening. This is the place that catches people up, especially as we've moved from chapter 5. Last week, you'll remember we read through chapter 6 together. But this is where we stumble and fall because we don't have the endurance to keep reading, to hear the way that this passage then works with the rest of the book. But I want to set it up like this. There is a declaration that has been made in chapter 5. Jesus, the Lamb, has already conquered. I'll just throw this out. If you get nothing this morning except for that, that's a good thing to start with. Jesus, the Lamb, has conquered. This is a good thing. This is good news. The entire book is then bookended. On one end, you have chapters 2 and 3, and on one end, you have chapters 21 and 22. One's kind of an intro. There's a little bit of a conclusion. There you go. I was looking for the word. On the other end, but there's kind of this bookend on either side. And on this side, chapters 2 and 3, you have 7 churches that are called to conquer. Exactly as the Lamb has conquered, as I have conquered. And then on this side, you have the promise announced for the ones who have conquered. So you see that works nicely. It kind of bookends them really well there. But the book leaves open then the question. It opens with the call. It ends with the promise. And so you're left wondering. I'm left wondering. So what does John think? Does the church win? Does the church conquer? Does the church actually do what it's been called to do? And so as we move forward into the book, we find there's another set of bookends working inside the book. And in Jewish writing, this is actually a really common way of organizing what you're doing. And it messes with us a little bit because we kind of like linear, but when you can recognize it, it's really helpful because one of the things that a Jewish writer would do is they would take two events that sound really similar or have similar features or characteristics, and they would put them like in the story. But they wouldn't be side by side. They would be one right after the other one. And usually there's some event that happens in the middle. And the second of the bookends, the second one, I guess that's backwards for you guys, right? Oh, there we go. The second one explains the first one. It helps you to understand what's happening in the first place. But both of them together are necessary to explain what's happening in the middle. So I'll encourage you to look at this week. Look at the Gospel of Mark. Look at the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. Look at how the feeding of the 4,000 gives you added meaning to the feeding of the 5,000, and then look at what both of them are saying about the event that happens between them. It's a very Jewish way of writing. That's happening. That's at work here in Revelation. Within the boundaries of the church's call to conquer in 2 and 3 and to receive the fullness of God in 21 and 22, there's this declaration in chapter 5 that Jesus has already conquered. But then what we find, these two events, are two depictions of a rider on a white horse. You might remember the rider on the white horse from last week, the first one in chapter 6. As part of the judgments. But then in chapter 19, what we just read with the arrival of the victorious Lamb, these pictures, if you set them side by side and read them beside each other, they're very different. They're very different from each other. And many have misinterpreted the first rider as being Jesus. Because the truth is, our imaginations, they default to imagining victory through conquest. That's all we can sort of imagine, because that's the way our world works. You achieve victory with a sword in your hand and by conquering and to conquer. That's what we know. And here's the thing that most of us can sort of accept within that imagination. Most of us can accept the idea that one time God would do something different. That one time Jesus could sort of have spiritual victory in our lives and in this world by dying at the hands of enemies. But come on, right? I mean, our common sense says, it kicks in and it tells us that he can't keep doing that. Final victory can't come from laying down your life. In fact, real physical victory has to have a sword. I mean, that's what our common sense says to us. This is what our imaginations want. And this is what John gives us in chapter 6, a vision of a rider with a sword conquering. But if we allow the second rider to make sense of the first one for us, we realize that the first rider, the one who conquers with a weapon in hand, this first rider represents our trust in the sword, our trust in conquerors, emperors, leaders who conquer with a weapon. It represents our trust in those and the judgment that's turned around on us by the emptiness of that trust. The second rider, when it shows up, it makes a mockery of the first because it actually does conquer. But again, in a very different way. This lamb, he comes, and the text tells us he is the true judge and that his war is just. But he doesn't have a weapon in his hand. This is the thing, this is one of those pieces that people always seem to miss in this passage. He doesn't have a weapon in his hand. His only weapon is And this is a powerful weapon when we read Genesis 1 and 2. The very voice that brings heavens and earth into being, the voice of God, the truth of God, is the weapon wielded by the Son. When the truth of God is spoken over our lives, we can't help but sit in judgment and realize that the ways that we have pursued that have been counter to the ways of Christ can do nothing but destroy. But there's another piece that we often miss. This rider is covered in blood. And it's often read that, well, this is the blood of his enemies. The problem is he's just shown up on the scene. He's just arrived. And if we want to be consistent with the imagery of Revelation, it makes sense that he would be covered in blood because he is a lamb who appears as though he has been slaughtered. And then, and we didn't read it this morning, but if you continue to read, just following it, you get a picture of the great war that's sort of imagined between the enemies of God and God, facing off. And it's this big battle, this big judgment day. And there's all this buildup and buildup and buildup, and I love it. Go ahead and read it this week. It says, and he took the enemy, threw him in. There's no battle. There's nothing. It's super anticlimactic because, really, is there anybody who can oppose God? And so it's the Lamb wins once and for all. And that's what we find here in this story. Again, though, refusing, not just one time on a cross, but again and again refusing to conquer with a sword in the way that we know and are familiar with. This is an important claim. This is a central claim to the book of Revelation because I think it makes sense of everything that happens between these two visions and the rest of the book. The Lamb has already achieved victory on the cross, yet there's a call for the church to conquer as the Lamb has. The Lamb then proves once and for all that conquering through self-giving love isn't just a one-time burp in the daily activities of God, but we are simultaneously reminded that those who live by the sword, they die by the sword. So the way of the conquering Jesus is the true way, and the way of conquering empires is not. And that's where the middle then looms. Will the church conquer as the Lamb has conquered? Revelation has a couple disheartening claims right there in the middle. There is an enemy at work, Revelation declares. An enemy who has declared war on the people of God. Revelation says that those who attempt to offer themselves in love for others, as the Lamb did before them, will be conquered by our enemies. That's a weird statement, right? The Lamb has already conquered. We're called to conquer. We're said to have conquered at the end, but will be conquered. This is provocative. What is John saying? And I love it because John doesn't shy away from using conquering language with its popular meaning. He is absolutely right. He's speaking the truth according to the world's expectations for conquering. The enemies of God appear to win. In chapter 11, which we already looked at, the passage of the two witnesses who sort of give us an image of the church's work. It says that the beast comes upon them and conquers them, kills them. And then the people stand over the bodies and they mock them. They dance over the bodies because they've had victory. They've killed them. What could possibly happen now? We've won. And on the surface, death always appears to be the end. But John gives an answer to the question, will the church be faithful? John is hopeful about the church's outcome. The church will be conquered. But in the midst of a vision, John even sees not only the faithfulness of the church, that God's people will in fact begin to offer their lives sacrificially in the way of the Lamb for other people, that this will become something that God's people do in the world, that they love people the way that Jesus did, offering themselves completely. John believes that they will do this, but that's not it. John believes that this work of God's people will actually partner with what Jesus did in order to achieve the final victory. Listen to what is said in chapter 12, verse 11. And they, this is the people of God, have conquered Satan by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even to death. What a beautiful testimony of the people of God and lives that matter. Can you begin to imagine a world where people live as though death isn't the worst thing in the world to ever happen to us? Might God begin to expand our imaginations and bring them into focus in such a way that our eyes could see clearly the path before us? Can we see the way of Jesus in front of us? Can we imagine a world where the victor isn't the one with the biggest sword, but the one who gives most freely and most fully of him or herself, that person is the one who's declared the victor with Christ? Can you imagine a world where conquerors aren't the ones who maintain something called peace through fear and intimidation, but the conquerors are the ones in whom the peace of Christ reigns, allowing them to suffer and enter into the hardships of this life with peace and trust, free from fear. Can you imagine? Can you imagine a world where all of our categories begin to be redefined according to the definitions of a victorious king who conquers by laying down his life for his enemies? Can you imagine your categories for life beginning to be reshaped? All of the categories that our world operates by, whether they're political, Republican, Democrat, liberal, socialist, conservative, whatever those are, whatever definitions, categories sort of bind you or sort of give shape and order to our world, could you imagine a God following one who's called Lord, who breaks those open and redefines the way of life, the way of true humanity? And as your imagination begins to be stretched and expanded, can we imagine what it might look like for us to live together as though this newly imagined world is possible now? Might we begin to treat people, regardless of their physical features, just going back to the early example, as beautiful, as bearing the image of God, believing they have something beautiful and of worth to provide this community and the world? Might we begin to reject some of the things of our world, some of the patterns of our world that promise to be for us what only Christ can be? None of this is achieved passively. Jesus didn't go to the cross passively. This is power, to lay down one's life for one's enemies. Revelation 21 declares, those who emerge victorious or as conquerors will inherit the new heaven and the new earth, and I will be their God, and they will be my sons and daughters. Are you beginning to see clearly? Pray with me. Father, would your words just drench our lives? Would our lives be so saturated in your word, in your words, in your hope, in your message, in your truth, in your goodness, that our imaginations can't help but begin to be refocused, to be expanded beyond what we know and what we can imagine to be on our own. God, would you do this? Would you continue to speak to us and invite us into your presence daily? God, would you help us to create that space in our lives to constantly hear from you, to have our lives changed and transformed and just busted open, God. I pray, Father, that our lives together, that this church, Lord, and each of us in it, Lord, that passage from Romans 12 would define us. That, Lord, we would not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but that together we would be transformed by the renewing of our minds. God, may our gatherings together be marked by the presence of your word, of your scriptures, of your love. May they be marked by our openness, Lord, to receive anything you would say to us and to be transformed by you and to respond. God, help us to be doers of your word. We love you, Father, and we thank you for meeting us in this place week after week. And we pray, God, that what we would offer you would bring glory to your name. We know that it doesn't increase our favor with you, that our actions, our works don't cause you to love us anymore. But God, you have been so good to us. You've been so good to us. Help us to just live lives that can't help but respond to your love by also extending radical generosity to you, Father, to our brothers and sisters, and to our world. May your grace just permeate our lives. We pray this in your Son, Jesus' beautiful, matchless, and conquering name. Amen.